when the constitutional arguments are passed in 1982, it is important to understand that that Trudeau sort of goes, yeah, well, I've done what I needed to do, and he retires from political life in 1984, which means that definitionally you've got a change in government, right? Even if it's just to a new prime minister in the same party. And by 1987, Brian Mulroney is prime minister, and he's from a different political party. He's on the conservative side. Trudeau's a liberal, so they've got this sort of idea. And starting in 1987, there's sort of this idea about how we're going to resolve the issues of Quebec's place in the Constitution, because for that period of time, there's this sort of sense of like, it's probably not a good idea to have one of the most populous provinces in Canada just not signing the Constitution because they don't think it represents their interests. Like, that's a problem. So starting in 1987, Mulroney starts talking about an idea of creating a constitution that Quebec can accept, quote, with dignity. And that phrasing is kind of important because it is addressing the reality that we still have a number of sort of separatist and nationalist sentiments in Quebec that haven't been resolved yet. There is sort of also a desire on the part of English Canada at this point to kind of bring Quebec back into the sort of community of provinces, and to sort of end what they see as sort of a particular problem for people. So by and large, the idea of fixing these problems sounds like a really good idea at this point in time. And it's an attempt to sort of shift and make public and make formal resolving some of those constitutional questions we talked about last. So this is perceived as an attempt to kind of manage and address the separatist sentiment in Quebec and to sort of remove that uncertainty, right? One of the things that we'll talk about when we get to sort of referendums in Quebec next is that the existence of these referendums and the existence of these sort of questions where a lot of Canadians were going, wait a minute, what do you mean there can be an election one day and my country looks completely different the next day because like a whole chunk out of the middle is missing? That's a kind of uncertainty that there was an incentive to deal with, an incentive to address. So this sort of idea about creating a constitutional accord Quebec could sign with dignity, a big part of that. And English Canada is also on board because there's an idea about creating something that would work for everyone, sort of put things together. Okay. We'll talk a little bit about what that looks like, but it is important to understand that those tensions in Quebec, specifically because of the relatively close, the 1970 referendum, no, 1980 referendum in Quebec, I'm getting my dates wrong. The 1980 referendum in Quebec was sort of perceived as being very, very close, the sort of 60-40 split. That was a lot higher than a lot of Anglophone Canadians thought that those results were going to be. They sort of figured like, yeah, it's a bunch of like yahoos in Quebec who think they want to separate. And then they discovered that no, it's actually 40% of the population. And so that became a different kind of conversation. So there's a lot of support for making that kind of change. Quebec's place in Constitution is in Confederation and in the Canadian state is difficult. Partially because Quebec has sort of pieces of different sort of modes of understanding, right? There's long-standing formal attempts to assimilate Indigenous populations in Canada. And there were some short-lived attempts to assimilate the Francophone population, but they kind of went away, but that didn't mean that the population was integrated, and in any event, the Francophone population was not subject to the same kind of rules as, for example, Indigenous people, because they were perceived as being by even the British elite sort of early on, yeah, they might be lesser than, but at least they're European and at least they're Christian, and we can sort of talk about that. So they were always understood in a somewhat different place. And the other sort of important tension to understand about Quebec's place in Confederation is that although there's a strong sense of trying to talking about Canada as an immigrant nation or a nation of immigrants in sort of most of Anglophone Canada, it is also really important to understand that a large portion of the population of Quebec does not see themselves as immigrants. Okay, this is sort of a long-standing issue that we could get into when we start talking about Indigenous rights. But because of the population, the way that the population of Quebec exists, right? Because of policies around la vengeance du berceau, the revenge of the cradle that we talked about last unit, because of those sorts of, that sort of sense of relative isolation of the francophone population from the population of France very early on in the 1700s, because of all of those factors, there are a lot of people in Quebec who understand themselves as Québécois and not as, well, I grew up in Quebec, but my family's from France, but my family has been here for centuries and I have no connection with the country of France at all. This is my country. And that's a very different position than many Anglophones occupy, and certainly a very different position than many of the Canadians who have other first languages and other sort of cultural connections, right? The relationship that much of the population of Quebec has to the sort of geography of Canada is quite different in terms of, this is mine and I have just as much right to it as, for example, Indigenous populations. A relatively common sentiment in Quebec, and they sort of have fights about legal rights to hunting and fishing and trapping and that sort of thing, in a way that, for example, immigrants to Canada from India don't have, because they sort of say, well, yes, I still maintain connections with India and I recognize my own migration story, and so I live in Canada, but the way that I understand the land is different because I understand that my family's an immigrant. There are a lot of people living in Quebec who do not see their families as immigrants. They see their families as Canadian, or Canadien, if you're sort of going to be technical about it. Okay? So that's like a brief sort of look at Quebec and Confederation. The next thing we're going to talk about is the Leech Lake Accords.